Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today, we are going through 2nd Chronicles chapter 6 and 7, and we're also going to do Psalm 136. Now, your reading for tomorrow is Psalm 134 plus Psalms 146 through 150. So, all of those in between as well. Let's jump into 2nd Chronicles chapter 6. Now, it starts out in chapter 6 with Solomon dedicating the temple. And then when we get to verse 12, we get Solomon's prayer. And this starts out, verse 12 in chapter 6 says, Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel and spread out his hands. Now, in the beginning of this, Solomon thanked God that the first half of what the Lord had promised had taken place. The temple had been built and the son of David was on the throne. Then he asked God to keep his second part of his promise, that perpetual dynasty of David's descendants, as long as they remain faithful. And they do, for the most part, for a while. So in verses 18 through 20, Solomon recognized that God was not confined to the temple, and we'll see illustrations and verses that talk about this, about God in heaven versus God in the temple versus God in the world. We'll see that a couple of times throughout this. Verses 22 through 23, though, we let's back up a little bit. Verses 21, there's going to be some needs that the people are going to have to be praying for and directing them. They're going to have to direct those prayers to the temple and to God. And Solomon asked the Lord to listen to these prayers and to respond to them. And then there's 7 scenarios that Solomon talks about here. The first scenario involved a man who had done some wrong and who needed to clear his name or to bring about the end of his punishment by taking an oath in the temple. And Solomon did not ask that the guilty person would be set free, but that justice would be done instead. He didn't say, because you're guilty, you're not going to be punished. He just said for justice to be done. The second scenario involved the Israelites turning away from God. The third scenario, which was verse 26 and 27, this implied that a drought in the land had been caused by the Israelites turning away from the Lord. In verse 28 through 31, the fourth scenario included a number of disasters that happened. In verse 32 and 33, the fifth scenario here, Solomon made his request on behalf of every foreigner who might come to the temple to seek God. And his prayer was that these foreigners would find their petitions answered, so Yahweh's name would be glorified among those who lived far away. In other words, outreach. He wasn't just focusing on the Israelites, but he was also focusing on foreigners and bringing them in and asking God to heal them as well, bringing the Gentiles, so to speak, the Jews and the Gentiles. You know, everyone that's not a Jew was a Gentile, and that's us, that's you and me. Verses 34 and 35 is a sixth scenario where Solomon asked God for strength in battle, and then verses 36 through 39 is the seventh and the last scenario that basically concerned the exile. The nation might be deported into a distant country. This possibly had already been mentioned by Moses in Deuteronomy 28 verse 33. What do you think? You think that's mentioning, that was a pre-mention of this? Solomon asked that once the people repented and started to pray in the direction of the temple, that the Lord would forgive them and bring them back to their own land. And that brings us to chapter 7. Chapter 7 starts with a dedication ceremony, and then it moves on to the Lord's response to that dedication ceremony. And one of the most popular verses in the Bible stands out like anything here, kind of like a sore thumb. It sticks out. And that verse is Second Chronicles 7:14. You hear that a lot nowadays, especially with the pandemic going on, with the election going on, with all the riots happening. People are praying for God to heal their land. And Second Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14 says, "If my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." You see, not only is he saying he's going to hear their sin, but he's saying he's going to hear their sin from heaven, meaning God is in heaven. He's not just confined to the temple, as we said earlier. Here's more evidence that he was in heaven as well as in the temple. And then we'll see elsewhere where he was also on earth and in other places. God's everywhere. He is eternal. He's everything and everywhere. But this being such a famous verse, I got to thinking, I wonder where this has been used in other places, historically speaking. A couple of those places were presidential inaugurations, as we had talked about previously with others, presidents taking their oath of office. Dwight D. Eisenhower placed his hand on this verse, as well as Psalm 127 verse 1, as he took the presidential oath of office in 1953. And one of my favorites, Ronald Reagan, placed his hand on 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14, as he took the presidential oath of office, both in 1981 and in 1985. So this verse clearly meant a lot to them. And speaking of prayer, that kind of reminded me, well, what else has happened with prayer in the United States? I know back in 1952, a National Day of Prayer was approved, but on January 25th, 1988, a lot of people don't know that the U.S. Congress, by joint resolution of the 100th Congress, declared the first Thursday of each May to be recognized as a National Day of Prayer. Now, this was a change from the previous National Day of Prayer. And this is the writing of the actual congressional resolution here. It says, "Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the joint resolution entitled Joint Resolution to provide for setting aside an appropriate day as a National Day of Prayer, approved on April 17th, 1952, Public Law 82-324, 66 Statute 64, is amended by striking a suitable day each year other than a Sunday, and inserting in lieu thereof the first Thursday in May in each year." So instead of just picking a random day, they actually dedicated a specific day, saying this is the day we're going to do it every year. And they're going to do it every single year. That reminded me a lot about how the Jews were every year on a specific day. They did specific things and specific prayers and even specific sacrifices, as we have read. And that's what I have for chapter 7. Now I'm going to move on to Psalm 136 very quickly. Psalm 136, I would have titled this, "His Love Endures Forever," if it were me. But that's not what the Bibles that I've read here have it titled. The CSB has this psalm titled, "God's Love is Eternal." All right, getting close. The New King James Version has it titled, "Thanksgiving to God for His Enduring Mercy." Now I will say, in the New King James Version, if you look at the end of every verse, it says, "His faithful love endures forever" in the CSB. But in the King James, it says, "His mercy endures forever." What versions are you reading, and what does it say in the second half of each of these verses? For instance, verse 1, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His faithful love endures forever." And it repeats that, "His faithful love endures forever," in every verse. What does that second part in your Bible say? I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button and the subscribe button. And of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow, for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.